Hi everyone, Tom here from Front End Beginners. In this video, we'll look at how to layer or overlap elements with CSS Grid. To begin with, let's create a div which will be our parent grid container. I'll give this div an ID of grid-container. Inside the grid, we'll add 3 more divs which will be our grid items or child items. We'll give each of these divs a class of grid-item. Inside these child divs, I'll add a span and give each div a number just for the sake of clarity. So in this first one, we have number 1, number 2, and number 3. In our CSS, let's begin by targeting our grid container div. For the sake of this example, I want to create a simple 3x3 square grid. I'll start by giving our parent container a width of 600 pixels and a height of 600 pixels. I'll then align it in the horizontal center of the page by setting its margin to 0 auto. Now I've set up its size and position, let's turn this div into our grid container. To do this, we first need to give it a display property of grid. Next, we'll set up 3 columns using the grid template columns property and setting its value to repeat followed by a pair of parentheses. Inside this pair of parentheses, we'll tell our CSS that we want 3 columns, so the number 3 followed by a comma, and each of these columns should have a width of 1 fr. Fr is a fraction unit. If we have 3 columns, each with a width of 1 fr, the total available width of our container div will be divided equally into 3 columns, each of which takes up 1 fraction of the total available space. In other words, without having to manually calculate the width of each column, we're asking our CSS to divide the available width into 3 equally sized columns. Each column is 1 fraction of the available space, or in this case, 1/3. Now we've got our columns set up, let's repeat this step for our rows. We'll use the grid template rows property, give it a value of repeat followed by a pair of parentheses, and we also want 3 rows each with a height of 1 fr. Let's have a quick look in the browser at what we've done so far. If you right click on the page and select Inspect, it'll open up the Chrome Developer Tools. If you're using a different browser, you may need to access the developer tools another way, but I personally recommend using Chrome as a front-end developer. If we navigate to our grid container element, we'll see that it has this grid icon next to it. If we click on this, Chrome will overlay the grid lines that we've just determined in the previous step. As you can see, we have a perfectly even 3x3 grid with 3 columns and 3 rows. Next, we'll set up some styling for our grid items. We'll target our grid item class and give each element a width and height of 200 pixels. For the sake of this example, each grid item will be the same size as one of our grid squares or grid cells. To align our span elements in the center of each div, I'll give each of our grid items a display property of flex, and I'll then target the grid item span and set its margin to auto. This simple trick will align a single child element dead center inside its parent element. I'll also increase the font size for the spans to 36 pixels. Let's have a quick look at this in the browser. We can see that our spans, which contain the numbers, are now dead center inside their square. Next up, let's make each of our grid items unique. To target the first grid item, I'll begin by targeting its class of grid item, followed by a colon, and then the nth of type pseudo selector. So nth dash of dash type followed by parentheses. Inside the parentheses we'll enter the number 1. If you have multiple elements in a row, like our 3 grid item divs here, nth of type allows you to select a specific element using a numeric value. By using nth of type 1, we're targeting the first of our elements of this type, or in other words, a div with the class of grid item. We'll give this first div a background color of E76F51, which is an orange color. Next, we'll select the second div by targeting its class, grid item, nth of type 2. We'll give this second div a background color of E9C46A, which is a mustard yellow color. Finally, for our third div, we'll give it a background color of 2A9D8F, which is a green-blue color. Let's have a look at this in the browser. Our 3 divs are now more clearly defined, which will make the positioning exercise easier to see. After setting up a grid, by default, child grid items are positioned into the first available grid cell, one individual square or space inside the grid, depending on their source order in the HTML. Our grid items are currently positioned one inside a cell in their source order of div1, div2, div3. If we cut our first div and paste it in to position 3, you'll see that our divs are now positioned in the order 2, 3, 1. So far, so good. Let's undo that and put our divs back in the correct order. Let's assume that we're happy with the positions of items 1 and 2, but that we want item 3, our green square, to be positioned in the bottom center of items 1 and 2, layered over the top of them both. I'll just turn the grid back on here. To do this, we need to remove item 3 from the regular flow by giving it an explicit position in our grid. If we look at where we're trying to place this, it's not inside a single grid cell. Rather, it's right in the center point of a grid area. A grid area is made up of several individual grid cells. In this case, it's the top 2 cells and the middle 2 cells. Our grid area is made up of these 4 cells here. To position item 3 in the middle of this grid area, let's define its position in our CSS. So for our third grid item here in our CSS, let's begin with its grid column property. Grid column determines within which column or columns we want an item to be. In this case, we want it to be in the first 2 columns. We're trying to position it here, right in the middle of this area, so we want it to be within the first 2 columns. To do this, we need to give our grid column property 2 numeric values. The first indicates the starting line, and the second indicates the end line. If we look in the browser, when we have clicked this grid icon and our grid overlay is displayed in Chrome, we can see these numbers running along the top and left here. You can ignore the ones on the right and bottom for now, which are negative numbers, as they can be slightly confusing. So we'll just look at the top and the left. We want to position our element in the first 2 columns. So our start position is line 1 and our end position is line 3. So in our CSS, in our grid column property, we want to start from line 1, we then enter a space and a / followed by another space, and we want to end on line 3. What we've done here in our CSS is to give our grid item an explicit position. We want it to be in the first 2 columns of our grid, and to do this we need to indicate between which 2 lines we want it to be positioned. So in this case it's between line 1 and line 3, which border the first 2 columns. Next, we'll do the same thing for the rows. Let's use the grid row property and also set its value to 1/3. We've now told our CSS to position child item 3 inside columns 1 to 2 and rows 1 to 2. Let's have a look in the browser. As you can see, this doesn't look quite right. Item 3 now appears to be inside the first cell, and our first and second items have been pushed over to the right-hand edge. What's actually happening here is that we've positioned item 3 inside a defined grid area, these first 4 cells, but its default position is to be at the top left of its grid area. Because item 3 has been explicitly positioned, but items 1 and 2 have not, 1 and 2 will simply fill the first available grid cells based upon their order in the HTML, just as we looked at earlier in the video. The area of 4 cells on the left has been taken up by our explicit positioning of item 3, so these 2 cells here on the right are the first 3 cells left over in the grid. So we've used these 4 for item 3, so item 1 then automatically positions itself in the first available cell and item 2 in the next available cell. If we use some CSS grid alignment properties, we can position item 3 exactly where we want it, which is right here in the center of this area. Let's begin by positioning it in the horizontal center using justify self center. This property aligns a specific grid item in the row or horizontal axis. Next, we'll use align self center. This property positions an element on the column or vertical axis. We can now see that item 3 is perfectly centered in its grid area. In fact, there's an even easier way to do this using CSS grid. The place self property combines both justify self and align self, so if we give place self a value of center and then remove our justify and align self properties, we'll see that we've achieved the same result. This may not seem like a big deal, but if we can do something with a single line of CSS, then why not? Now let's move on to fixing the position of grid items 1 and 2. Earlier, we said we wanted them in their original positions. So let's target the first grid item and place it back in the first grid cell. To do that, we need to use our grid column and grid row properties. So let's look at which numbers we need for those. To be in the first column, we need our item to be between column lines 1 and 2. And to be in the first row, we need our item to be between row lines 1 and 2. So for both values, we want it to be between 1 and 2. So we'll use grid column 1/2 and grid row 1/2. Let's have a look. Item 1 is now back in the first grid cell, and item 2 has moved itself into the first available cell, which is where item 1 had been previously. You'll also notice that item 3 hasn't been affected by this and remains in the position we explicitly specified earlier. Let's get item 2 back in place in the second grid cell along the top row. Its grid column values will need to be lines 2 and 3, and its grid row values will need to be lines 1 and 2. So our second item, grid column 2 and 3, grid row 1 and 2. Our 3 elements are now positioned exactly where we wanted them. Let's quickly talk about layering for a moment. You'll notice that item 3 sits on top of items 1 and 2. That's because item 3 comes last in the HTML. By default, items that are positioned later in the HTML order will be stacked on top of items that come before them. So 3 will be layered on top of 2, and 2 will be layered on top of 1. If you want to change this, for example, if we wanted item 2 to be on the top, you can use the z-index property to manually override the stacking order. Let's give item 2 a z-index of 99. This is a high value, which will mean that its z-index position will be on top of any of the other items around it. As you can see, item 2 is now positioned on top of item 3 because it has a higher z-index, but item 3 is still positioned on top of item 1 because neither of these have an explicit z-index, and this is the default order in the HTML document. Let's remove this z-index value before looking at one final thing. Finally, I want to touch on fine-tuning the position of our grid items. So far, we've explicitly positioned them using grid column and grid row values, as well as using alignment properties such as justify, align, and place self. But what if we want even more control? Let's say that we want to nudge item 2 down by 50 pixels and to the left by 50 pixels, just to make our layout a little more interesting. There's 2 ways we can do this. The first is by using the CSS transform translate property. This works, but has one major drawback in that transforms affect the stacking context. Let's give item 2 a transform translate value of -50 pixels, 50 pixels. This instructs the browser to shift the element's position by -50 pixels on the x-axis, 50 pixels towards the left, and 50 pixels on the y-axis, 50 pixels towards the bottom. If we look in the browser, we can see that item 2 has now moved accordingly, however the stacking order has been affected. Item 2 is now stacked on top of item 3, which breaks the default order. To get around this, we need to give item 3 a higher z-index value to stack it back on top of item 2. If we were nudging the positions of multiple elements, we'd need to give each of these a unique z-index value to ensure each was positioned in the correct order. You can see how this could quickly get messy. The better way, in my personal opinion, is by using the CSS position property. Let's remove the transform property from item 2 and replace it with position relative. Next, we'll adjust its left position by -50 pixels and its bottom position also by -50 pixels. So we're pulling the item left by 50 and pulling to the bottom by 50. If we look at this in the browser, I know what you might be thinking. This also breaks the stacking context. Item 2 is now also on top of item 3. In this case though, fixing it is simpler. We just need to apply position relative to any item whose stacking context has been affected and everything will be restored to normal. So in this case, item 3 has had its stacking context affected. So if we give this one a position of relative, you'll see that 3 is now back on top, 2 is underneath it, and 1 is underneath both. While this may not seem like any less work, I can assure you that fiddling around with multiple different z-index values is much more of a headache. By applying position relative to our elements, their original source order remains the same, and we don't need to figure out which element has what z-index value. Both methods work, but the position relative way is my personal preference. Let's turn off the grid and see what we've done. So, that more or less sums up the basics of layering and overlapping elements with CSS Grid. If you want more than one element to occupy the same space in the grid, remember that you need to explicitly position your elements using the grid column and grid row properties. You can fine-tune your positioning using either transform translate or position relative in combination with top, bottom, left or right values. If you experience problems with the stacking order, remember to apply either the appropriate z-index values to your elements or use position relative on the affected items. CSS Grid is a really powerful tool for creating web layouts. While the design I've created in this example isn't going to win any awards, I hope it demonstrates the potential of layering and overlapping and the precision with which you can position elements. I'd personally suggest flipping through some magazines or coming up with some interesting designs of your own, and then sketching these down on a sheet of paper and trying to recreate them in the browser using CSS Grid. This is a really great way to practice and familiarize yourself with the tool. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer as soon as possible. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.